Chapter 1. A Life Ablaze. Do you struggle to keep the fire of the Holy Spirit burning in your heart as it may have burned earlier in your life? Do you sometimes feel like all that is left are a few small glowing embers, and that perhaps even those embers are starting to die out and become cold? If this description hits close to home as you evaluate your Christian walk, I have two questions to ask you. How do you stoke the embers of the fire within you so that it begins burning red hot in your heart again? No fuel, no fire. In this book, I want to speak to you about the different kinds of fuel you may need to stay spiritually ablaze. But to begin with, I want to tell you a story from our family's earliest days in the former USSR that will demonstrate my point about doing whatever is necessary to keep the fire burning. In the early years, just after we moved to the former USSR, my wife Denise and I purchased an apartment in the heart of our city for our family to live in. But when we purchased it, it was abandoned and in miserable condition. Honestly, it was so ruined that it should have been condemned. It was a morass of mold, collapsed ceilings, and plaster falling off the walls. But we could see what it could be with lots of hard work, so we purchased it and went to work restoring it. After the restoration was complete, that apartment became as elegant as it had been nearly 100 years earlier. When the work was finished, the walls were covered with fine wallpaper and magnificent chandeliers hung once again from giant hand-carved medallions in the center of the ceilings. The giant-sized crown molding that was wrapped around the ceilings of each room had been meticulously restored. Every room had intricate, new parquet floors to match those that had existed before the Revolution, and the 9 fireplaces, one for each big room and in each bedroom, were the most magnificent features of the apartment. Once restored, those fireplaces looked like they belonged in a museum. But although our apartment had been restored, every other apartment in the big building was still remaining in a state of devastation and abandonment. Eventually, the entire building would be beautifully restored, but when we moved into our apartment, the other apartments and the central staircase of the building looked like something that had been bombed in World War II. The stairs were navigable, but those areas had been so long abandoned that derelicts actually slept in our entryway. City authorities told us a citywide heating system would be connected to the building before the winter. So in anticipation, we installed new pipes in the walls to carry the heat to every room. But as the weather turned cold and winter approached, it became apparent that the promised heat was not coming that year and that our family would be living in freezing temperatures inside that apartment. It was a serious problem because this was very far north and the city became very cold in winter. I realized we'd have to use those lavish museum-quality fireplaces to provide heat for our family. As much as I didn't want to do it, it would be a necessity for surviving the harsh winter. But transporting wood was very difficult because the apartment was in the very center of that historic city and there was no nearby source of wood. In desperation, our 2 oldest sons came up with an innovative idea about where to get wood so our family would have heat for the winter. When it's really cold, it's a good time to get creative, and our sons thought of something Denise and I would have never thought of in a million years. The apartment directly below us was abandoned and destroyed by years of neglect. It is impossible to exaggerate its horrible condition. No one owned it at that point, so it had continued to deteriorate. In fact, we learned that the many previous residents of the apartment we purchased had contributed to its sad demise. When we purchased the apartment, our bathroom floor had a hole next to the toilet where men had missed the toilet bowl for so many years that the urine had eaten a hole through the floor. For years, urine had dripped into the apartment below us. That huge empty apartment below us was so destroyed that nothing could be salvaged from it. Walls were half gone, fireplaces were destroyed and crumbling, windows were broken, and the winter wind was blowing through it. The broken window frames and shattered glass window panes were especially bad for us because Our apartment was located directly above, and we could feel the effect of the freezing winter wind blowing through the apartment beneath our floor. Our building was constructed from brick and plaster, so our apartment held on to that cold almost like it was a refrigerator. The floors of that apartment below us had once been covered with splendid, expensive parquet, with all types of inlaid exotic woods and intricate designs. But now those floors were warped and ruined from water leaks and the long term acid effects of urine. The parquet was bowed by water damage. It was half ripped up, and it was lying in heaps of irreparable shattered pieces all over that apartment. One freezing early morning, Denise and I were pondering what to do with the cold temperatures getting worse by the day. Suddenly, our three sons jumped up, put on their coats, dashed out the door, and disappeared as if they were on an urgent mission. When they reappeared some time later, they jubilantly walked through the door of the apartment with heaping armloads of 100-year-old parquet flooring they had gathered from the floor of the devastated apartment below us. Denise and I watched with shock as the boys piled that old historic parquet into each of our magnificently restored fireplaces, and then worked on each pile until a fire was blazing strong. That wood was so old and dry that it began quickly popping and burning, and soon the brick and plaster walls of that apartment began to warm up in every room, fueled by wood flooring from the apartment below that our sons had collected and used as fuel for fire. When the fire started to die down and it felt like the temperatures were dropping, we'd open the metal doors to the fireplaces to see if the fire was going out. If we saw that there was nothing left but embers, the boys would quickly put on their jackets, rush down 2 flights of steps to the abandoned apartment below, and rip up more flooring, which any eventual buyer would have had to replace anyway. Soon the boys would be back with armloads of ruined antique parquet flooring. They would first break the dry, rotted parquet into smaller pieces. Then they would shove the pieces through the fireplace doors into the fire, and almost immediately the house would start warming up again. That winter, we kept our apartment constantly warm because of the blazing heat that was produced in our fireplaces from the antique flooring of that downstairs abandoned apartment. As long as wood was on the fire, we knew we would have heat. But if there was no wood left to burn, if only embers remained, it was certain that the fire would go out unless we took action. Fuel was essential to keep those fires going in our fireplaces. It's just a fact that when fuel of any sort is depleted, fire eventually goes out. Often there was enough wood to keep the fire burning, but the embers needed to be stoked, moved around, and repositioned with a long poker. We'd insert that long iron rod into the fireplace and rigorously rake the embers back and forth and side to side to provide more oxygen and keep the fire burning longer. In fact, if we didn't regularly stoke those embers and fan the flames, we discovered that the fire could go out even if there was enough wood to keep it burning. Those embers had to be tended to regularly to keep the fire going. We learned that it takes a lot of attention and a lot of work to keep a fire burning bright. It's just a fact that when fuel of any sort is depleted, fire eventually goes out. When it was my turn to stoke the embers, at times I'd reflect on the Apostle Paul's words to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, where Paul wrote, "Wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God, which is in thee by the putting on of my hands." The words stir up are from the Greek word anadzupurio, a triple compound of the Greek words ana, Zeus, and pur. The word ana carries the idea of repeating an earlier action or doing something again. The word Zeus is from the word zeo, which means to be enthusiastic, to be fervent, to be passionate, to be vigorous, to be wholehearted, or to be zealous. And the word pur is the Greek word for fire. Now, it must be noted that in classical Greek, fire was a life-giving force. Fire was used on the hearths of every ancient home to keep people warm. It was used in matters related to the divine and supernatural, and it was used as a force to defeat enemies. Fire was central to life and considered essential for one's existence. In fact, human life is unsustainable without fire, a point that I'll address in just a moment. But when these three Greek words are compounded, they form the Greek word anadzuperio, the very word Paul used in 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 6 when he told the younger minister to stir up the gift of God that was in him. It implies that the fire in Timothy's heart has ebbed to embers or was on a low burn. That is the reason Paul told Timothy to begin to passionately and rigorously stoke and stir up the gift of God in his life. Paul was telling Timothy that just as one would stoke the embers of a fire in a hearth or a fireplace, it was time for the younger minister to take action. Paul was commanding Timothy to reach within himself and to begin to rekindle, to kindle anew the fire in his heart. At the time Paul wrote to Timothy, this young man was surrounded by a great deal of chaos and confusion because of the intense persecution that was taking place at the time. It is probable that the younger minister was physically and emotionally exhausted from dealing with an onslaught of problems and that his own spiritual fire was beginning to wane. That is why Paul told him to take action before the fire inside of him that burned for the things of God went out completely. Paul was commanding Timothy to reach within himself and to begin to rekindle or kindle anew the fire in his heart. In other words, Timothy needed to open the door to his heart, look inside to determine the condition of his inward fire, and then take action to stir up the gift of God inside him. Like a person would stoke the coals in a fireplace, Timothy was being called to stir the embers and then put more wood on the fire. This would not occur accidentally. Timothy would have to be intentional and proactive to keep that flame burning. But if he would heed Paul's command, that inward fire, which was beginning to wane, would blaze once again in the core of Timothy's spiritual being. In those early days of living in the former Soviet Union, our family learned the lesson that if we wanted to have heat, we would have to become proactive in making it happen. We had to find fuel. We had to carry it upstairs. We had to open the fireplace door. We had to put the fuel on the fire, and we had to stoke the fuel regularly through the day to keep it burning. We knew we'd reap a lot of cold, unnecessary discomfort and even serious trouble should we decide to neglect what was happening deep in those fireplaces. If we discovered that the fire had ebbed too low and the coals of wood were turning cold and hard, that we had hit a low burn, well, we would have had to begin the process all over. So the choice to be proactive was wiser than reaping the consequences produced by negligence. The truth is, we made the choice to do whatever was required to stay warm, because otherwise we knew we'd freeze. It is the same for you. If your spiritual fire is at a low burn or close to going out, it's time for you to stir up the gift of God that is inside you. You cannot depend on someone else to do the stoking and stirring for you. It is so vital that you take responsibility to look inside yourself, to determine your fuel supply, and do whatever you must do to stir your spiritual embers and keep your fire burning. If you'll ask the Holy Spirit, He'll show you how to open the door to your heart and take an honest look on the inside to assess your condition and need. Then you must let Him show you the steps to take and the kinds of fuel you'll need to activate and fully utilize in your life. You are called to consistently stir up those embers and fuel that fire so you will remain a blazing inferno for Jesus. If your spiritual fire is at a low burn or close to going out, it's time for you to stir up the gift of God that is inside you.